Another sun rises in the year 1073, and Pope Gregory VII is in an outrage. Anti-church propaganda and pagan filth is everywhere, and he cannot light enough fires of his own to stunt their blaze. He's only just started his papacy, and already he's overwhelmed by the dirty art he sees. And none other is more offensive to his eyes than the poetry. The unbridled lusting, the praises sung to gods whose names he cannot pronounce, and, scandal, the allusions to never-ending fornication. Man with man, woman with woman, pauper with lord, when does it all end? And nobody makes his blood boil more than that of one Greek poetess. Her hymns stay in his brain long after they're burned. Her adoration of breasts and flowing hair sickens him. But even he has not strength enough to denounce her lyrical genius. This woman, this 10th muse, is none other than the world-renowned Sappho. Not gonna lie, that drama was kind of fun. Hi, my name is Mia, and welcome to another episode of Rainbow Relics, the series that introduces you to all the incredible queer people that shaped our world's history. This week is all about Greek lyrical poet and teacher Sappho of Lesbos. Links to sources and further readings are listed in the description below, like always. As you can probably tell from my introduction, I'm very excited to finally be putting up this episode. I owe the very name of my sexuality to this near-mythic woman, and I hope I can handle her story with the care it deserves. Allow me to take you back in time to a little island off the coast of Greece. The year is somewhere between 630 and 615 BCE, in the city of Mytilene, when Cleis and her husband Scamandronymus welcome into their home and lives a tiny baby girl. Very little is known about Sappho's life as a whole, and unfortunately this is especially true of her childhood. It is assumed, from fragments of her poetry, that she had at least 3 brothers, Caraxus, Eurygeus, and Lyricus, who, I don't know if I pronounced that right, so to me they're Charles, Eugene, and Larry. Her family could have been wealthy traders or wine exporters with close ties to Lydia and Asia Minor, or they could have been political exiles forced into southern Italy. There are 7 other names that have been attributed to Sappho's father, and her mother may not have been her mother at all. As some scholars have pointed out, Cleis can be translated into slave. To make her biography even more confusing, all of Sappho's poetry was written in the Aeolic dialect of Greek, notorious in the fact that only a handful of the old Latin scholars were able to translate it, since it had barely any linguistic influence and was used far less often than other Grecian dialects. A lot, if not all, of her poetry that we have now is a transcription of a transcription of a translation of a translation. Errors and edits made by those who transcribed them were bound to slip in. Even in Greece at the time, the idea of only one person compiling an entire work was pretty rare. Just like in the case of Homer, there may have been multiple women, or even multiple people, cross-genders, who wrote under the collective pen name of Sappho. But all of her history can agree that it looks much nicer in hindsight to have one homoerotic poet, not a collective or, as some have stated, a completely fictional character. All of this doesn't mean that there's no information on Sappho, only that it's not as readily available as some other people, and a certain amount of guesswork based on the societies and structures of her time needs to be relied upon. Taking from where she lived, her social status, and lines in her poetic fragments, scholars are fairly certain that Sappho oversaw a thyasos. For those of you like me who cannot speak ancient Greek, a thyasos is a group of women who live in a community of shared religious or educational background. These communities are usually implemented amongst younger women to teach them how to be wives and to fit into their corner of society. A patron goddess presides over them, and Sappho is known for worshipping Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, and acting as her intermediary in both poetry and rituals. This was ancient Greece, and it is almost certain that part of these rituals involved at least a dash of homoeroticism. And even in Sappho's poetry, she uses the terms love and passion almost interchangeably, which is an extremely Aphrodisian teaching. A lot of instruments and associations of the goddess make their way into her poetry, such as flowers, garlands, perfume, and incense. She even takes the time to implore Aphrodite to help her flirt with a young girl she has become infatuated with. But honestly, who among us wouldn't want to date Sappho? Her poetry was widely circulated in Lesbos, and probably a lot more of Greece, though it's uncertain how. Word of mouth must certainly have played a large part in it, and it could not have hurt her fame that her Thyasos became one of the more popular ones to abound. Wealthy parents are said to have heard of her and sought her directly for their daughter's tutelage, unless absolutely none of this happened. Some sources say that Sappho was a headstrong poetess only, and that the idea of her as a teacher came from confusion between her and her most promising protege, Demophila, because I can't pronounce Greek names, who I like to think she was the girl who she fell in love with and asked Aphrodite for help. Anyways, that's his headcanon. Demophila did run a girls' school in Pamphylia, Greek, but again, confusion seeps in. Maybe Sappho ran the school first and handed it to Demophila, to her girlfriend to take over and carry on the teachings. Sappho's poetry could have been carried with her, reaching the ears of Plato, who called her the 12th muse, which scholars later changed to the 10th muse to make more sense alongside Greek mythology. Plato was sure to have found a queer reading in Sappho's poetry, both because he was one of the first people besides Homer to draw a queer conclusion to the story of Achilles and Patroclus in the Iliad, and also because Sappho's poetry is extremely explicit in its meanings. That was kind of the beauty of her poetry. With a distinctive lyrical structure of 3 long lines followed by 1 short one, and a command over the most tender phrases in Aeolic, Sappho's poetry had the power to bring anyone to tears of yearning for lovers lost or yet to be discovered. Once again, love, that loosener of limbs, bittersweet and inescapable crawling thing, sees me. Love is fruitless and love is painful, and love is all there is to live for within the lines of her verse. Sappho is remembered as a very headstrong woman due to the plain nature of emotions that she writes, and she did not escape this without ridicule. Obviously, any woman who was confident enough to speak her mind must have been a prostitute. These rumors sparked the idea that there were in fact 2 separate Sapphos, one a renowned poetess, and the other a mysterious lady of the night. People again contradict this by describing Sappho as short in stature with a ruddy, weather-worn complexion. She was criticized as a masculine woman, and 3 centuries after her death, she was parodied as a rather promiscuous lesbian in the new comedy. This is meant to be taken to say that she was unattractive, but it could just as easily conjure up ideas of a woman who spends her days outside in the open, chasing young girls such as Athos, Telesippa, and Megara, and schooling others in the ways of Aphrodite, maiden manners, and the lyre. A large volume of her work is said to have been written to specifically be read with a lyre accompaniment, hence terming her a lyric poet. She was also said to have had a hand in the invention of the plectrum, as scholars have pulled from a depiction of her playing a lyre with a plectrum off a vase from the 6th century BCE. This is not at all unlikely, and it's clear from the rest of the sources that she must have been a creative and inventive woman. She is the only female poet to stand amongst the Library of Alexandria's shrine of 9 lyric geniuses, and one of the few poetesses to have come from antiquity. Her face was minted on coins that briefly circulated around the area which she lived, and the famous poet Algernon Charles Swinburne claimed he thought of her poetry to best that of both Homer and William Shakespeare. And much of the aesthetic circles of Victorian society agreed with that sentiment and one similar, and kind of took her as their unofficial mascot. While I couldn't find anything concrete, I think it's fairly likely that Oscar Wilde came across Sappho's poetry and possibly found resonance there, both because of her inherently romantic nature and the pains the eroticism in her work gave to the Victorian censorship models, which I'm sure he can appreciate. While there is far less information available on Sappho than there is on most of her contemporaries, it is fascinating that such a wealth can be found through little more than poetic fragments. Indeed, there are a total of 3 sources for her life: her poetry, of course, the Suda, and references and quotations from other better preserved ancient writers. Most of what survives is probably less accurate than would be hoped, due not in part to the purging of unholy works by the Church in 1073, headlined by Pope Gregory VII. So, burning anything that had the remotest bit of fun in it. The Pope had attempted to burn all of her work, primarily focusing on the 9 books compiled of her verse from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, but thankfully for us, Sappho had just as many supporters as she had enemies. Her work had been copied, transcribed, quoted, and edited to the point where it would have been impossible for the Church to find everything. Many of the quotations we have now come from the 8th and 9th centuries CE. Now again, there are several volumes of Sapphic fragments and even one complete poem, the Ode to Aphrodite. And there is a fly in my room. He's really bugging me. Anyways, in 2004, a poem of hers was found chronicling the deprivations of old age, which leads me to one of the most widely spread stories about Sappho. Many who hear of her, after they think of lesbians, think of Kerkulis. This fly. So now, for those of you who don't know, because you've just come out to yourself or have never heard of Sappho before today or any other valid excuse, Kerkulis was the man said to be Sappho's husband. He came from the neighboring island of Andros, and after Eros shot both of them with his arrows, Sappho bore a daughter by him and named her Clais in honor of her mother. But Kerkulis was a sailor by trade, and on one of his journeys his ship encountered a vicious storm. Unsuspecting and unprepared, Kerkulis and his crew perished. News of this tragic fate reached Sappho, and seized by the heavy chains of woe, raced up a cliff and plunged to her death amongst the sharp rocks and waves. Or, again, absolutely none of that happened. As I've said, Clais is very similar to the Aeolic word for slave, and Kerkulis too has an interesting translation. Just like today, Andros means man, and Kerkulis is an old Greek word that is roughly equivalent to a name of the male reproductive organ. In short, Sappho of Lesbos was married to Penis Man. And there is just as much evidence that this is a dramatic joke as there is for Sappho to have lived a long, fulfilling life and quietly laying herself to rest about the year of 550 BCE. The sailor Kerkulis was her doomed husband, or never even existed. The last few years have had notable discoveries when it comes to finding out information about the elusive, unofficial lesbian patron. In 1914, on the cusp of World War I, papier-mâché coffins found in England contained more fragments of poetry attributed to Sappho. I'm not entirely certain about the facts here, so proceed with caution, but this may have been papyrus given to the scholar Dirk Abink in 2012. He originally assumed the poems to be from 200 CE, but upon further inspection, he saw that they must have been far older than the paper they were written on. All parts of the poem, from its dialect, its meter, its diction, its long vowels, absolutely everything pointed to Sappho. The fragments found by Abink had 2 names repeated throughout, Lyricus and Caraxes. Larry and Charles, Sappho's siblings, had been found. Quickly, the fragments were carefully preserved, and today they make up the piece that has so creatively been titled The Brothers' Poem. If such a famous example of Sappho's work has been found only a decade ago, what's to stop even more of her poems to resurface in the future? History is always changing, and I don't think more discoveries of her should be discounted. Hang on, if you heard that massive sigh, that was my dog. She doesn't want to leave me. But Sappho, Sappho has changed the course of poetic history and given us some of the most common words in the LGBT vernacular. Without her poetry, the meaning of lesbian would never have been changed in the 6th century from person from Lesbos to a woman attracted to woman. The term sapphic would be non-existent, and the Victorian aesthetic dandies would not have had their mascot. She had no reason to pave the way for gay rights, as her society already took homosexual love in its stride, but she did give women of her future someone to identify with. She walked the road and documented her journey, and she made sure that no lesbian ever need feel alienated or alone. I want to add on, as a closing note and a apology for the absolute disaster that this episode has been. I haven't slept in days, but I finally have time to record and I jumped at it. But yeah, basically I was talking to my friend about Sappho while I was going through all my notes and checking a few things, and she brought up that Sappy and Sappho have like a similar makeup and sound to them. Yeah, I don't know, I wanted to add that. I don't know if they're linked, I didn't look. I don't want to look in case they're not linked. I want to live with this idea in my head. Because like, it works, right? I don't know if today Sappho would want to call herself Sappy. She feels like a little bit, she's proud and she holds herself towards herself, and sappy doesn't seem like something someone proud would say. But her writing's pretty sappy. I'm rambling. Have a fantastic rest of your day. I hope this episode was halfway listen. I'm gonna take a nap. Goodbye.